thanks very much for coming out this evening. And thanks, of course, to Cavan County Libraries for the invitation to talk to you today. I've changed the title a little bit. I hope you don't mind. I said rather than stop at the Congo, I try to bring it up to the present day as much as possible. But rather than try to cram a century's worth of history into the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to dip in and out and pick some of the key moments as I see them, and pick on some of the more interesting moments, some of the more important moments in the Defence Forces history, and I'll try to bring us up to the Commission on the Defence Forces. A quick few words on that at the very end, if we get there on time. If I don't ramble too much, if I go off track, just I know you'll let me know, and I'll get back on track. So just to say that, I'll leave my clicker. To start with the beginning, and you have here on the slide, this is a copy of An Tóglacht, which was the newspaper of the IRA, and then of course went on to become the newspaper of the Defence Forces after, from 1922 up to 1933. And this extract, this quote, is from an editorial published in December 1921, when the terms of the treaty were now widely known and the rumbles of dissent were already apparent, both nationally, politically, but within the IRA. And the editorial says that the army is the servant of the nation, and that's where I got the subtitle for the book. I think it's a leitmotif for the Defence Forces history from 1922 right onwards, and I thought that was a really telling moment. But the editorial says that the army will obey the national will expressed by the chosen representatives of the people and interpreted through the proper military channels. Now, as things transpired, of course, that's a forlorn hope. Without recapping, and I don't want to go through the tortuous path, the Dáil and the country were split into pro and anti-treaty factions, and that, of course, was the fate of the IRA as well. And of course, that's the context then in which the National Army is actually founded, an emerging split within the IRA and a slow descent into civil war. But when did the National Army then, I suppose, first appear in public? Now, we're having Wi-Fi issues, so I can't play you this clip, but this is a British Pathé newsreel filmed on the 1st of February 1922, and it depicts the very first regular uniformed unit of an Irish army marching down Dame Street, past the Olympia Theatre, past City Hall, on its way to Beggars Bush to take over the barracks from the British Army. It's largely composed, this unit is largely composed of members of Michael Collins' squad and the Dublin Active Service Unit, and they become known as the Dublin Guard, and they really are representative of the very first step in the transformation of the IRA to the National Army. So the 1st of February then, it's a key foundation date for the National Army, not just because you see an army or the first unit in uniform. A couple of days later then you see the very first public funds made available to the National Army, and the first payment to troops within the National Army as well, all happened within the first few days of February. And those pay records, they actually provide a very useful method of tracking the development in the early months and years, and they demonstrate that recruitment was frequently very, very haphazard for the next 8 months, right through the beginning of the Civil War. And the example that I always use to illustrate just how haphazard and, I suppose, chaotic that early recruitment was is a report from Major General Sean McEoin, who was GOC Western Command at the time, in early August. And he says to Michael Collins that he's uncertain as to the whereabouts of at least 1,000 men who had apparently enlisted with his unit, but he wasn't sure if they were still part or if they'd gone over to the anti-treaty IRA. So just then to move on to this, again, this is an image of that very, very first unit in uniform. This is taken in Beggars Bush Barracks on the 4th of February 1922, and I think that it very neatly encapsulates some of the contradictions that run through the Civil War. It's a landmark moment for the Defence Forces and the state. What I've highlighted in the square there is the commanding officer, Paddy O'Daly. He played a key role in the fight for Dublin during the Civil War, in the first month of the Civil War, and later becomes officer commanding in Kerry Command. And that's there his story takes a darker turn, as it's under his command that numerous reprisal killings were committed in Kerry, most infamously at Ballyseedy. And these, of course, were in retaliation for the killing of National Army troops by anti-treaty trap mines. And so the Dublin Guard, who were that very, very first unit in uniform, would go on to become synonymous with some of the worst excesses of the National Army during the war itself. Now, the creation of the army, this is just a nice image of O'Connell Street in the midst of the battle for Dublin. The creation of the National Army, it presents a huge range of logistical problems, not least of which was that requirement to transform the semi-autonomous, semi-independent unit of the IRA into a professional, organised, disciplined force. And And to make matters worse, much of that organisational work, of course, is undertaken in the midst of war. So by the time the Civil War begins in June 1922, there's perhaps 7,000 men in uniform or enlisted in the National Army. On paper, they're massively outnumbered by the anti-treaty IRA, but they're obviously much better equipped because of the equipment that they get from the British forces. And after the battle for Dublin has been won in early July, the provisional government issues a national call to arms, and that leads to a resulting strength by early August or mid-August of over 30,000 men. So a huge number enlisted in a very, very short period, which brings, of course, problems of training and discipline and organisation. And of course, August 1922 also sees the deaths both of Arthur Griffith and of Michael Collins, who was then the Commander-in-Chief of the Army. And the level of preparatory work that had been undertaken in May, June and July, I think, and organisational work by the General Staff just across the summer of 1922 was, I think, incredibly important in terms of absorbing the shock of the loss of its Commander-in-Chief and allowing the National Army to continue functioning relatively effectively. So Collins is replaced as Commander-in-Chief by Richard Mulcahy, who's the second man on the left. He's also Minister for Defence. Sean McMahon, who's the first on the left, he took up the post of Chief of Staff. And Gerard O'Sullivan is appointed as Adjutant General. Now, he's not in that picture. And Sean O'Murhilla, who's on the far right, is Quartermaster General. So that preparatory work that they had undertaken included a sort of a gradual movement towards the professional structures that you would see in other professional European armies at the time, and away from those associated with the IRA. So on the 5th of July 1922, you have 3 regional commands created: Eastern, Western and Southern. And just a week later, that's tweaked to become five commands: Western, Southwestern, Eastern, Southeastern and Curragh. And of course, the Army's structure is again altered in January 1923 in what was really the very, very first large-scale reorganisation and the first time that it began to take on the form of the current Army, as you might say. And it's based on a scheme drafted by Major General Emmett Dalton. So the country is divided into 9 regional commands at that point, and the infantry rearranged into just under 70 battalions. And only the 3rd Infantry Battalion of the current Defence Forces can trace its origins directly to that reorganisation in January 1923. So what about the air and naval wings of the National Army? They were both established in 1922, and to look at the naval arm first, the Defence Forces, they enjoyed a lot of success. The Defence Force, the National Army, enjoyed a lot of success outflanking anti-treaty troops in the summer of 1922 when it landed at Westport, Fennet, and of course, most importantly, at Cork in July and August of 1922. But what becomes known as the Coastal and Marine Service really starts to take shape in January and February of 1923. That's when the government authorises the purchase of 12 armed trawlers from the British Admiralty at a cost of about £87,000, which is a significant outlay for that time. They were headquartered at Portobello Barracks, which is a bit unusual. And the CMS, as they called it, the Coastal Marine Service, it consisted of 3 elements. So there was a coastal infantry, a coastal patrol, and a marine investigation department that overlapped. All of their duties overlapped enormously with structures that were already in place for the revenue and for coastal patrols that already existed. Major General Joseph Vyse was put in charge of the CMS, and unfortunately for him and for the CMS itself, the whole service got off to a terrible start. The 12 trawlers were due to be overhauled in Britain first and then sent over to Ireland, but a political decision was taken to have them brought over to Ireland and overhauled at Haulbowline. None of the skill set was available in Haulbowline because most of the British personnel who had worked there had gone back to Britain. So what happened was the 12 trawlers ended up sitting in dry dock for several months, and that put the CMS on the back foot from the very, very beginning. You have here on the screen, by the way, this is the SS Dainty, which was the flagship of the Coastal Marine Service. You can see at the aft, the tricolour and the crew are gathered on the foredeck. Now Mulcahy, because of the delay in getting these trawlers into the water, Mulcahy and the General Staff, they were very, very quickly turned against the service, and they just argued that it was just an expensive luxury. So the rather, I suppose, unbelievable decision was taken in October 1923 to dismantle the service altogether, so which leaving this island, or the island state, the new island state, without a navy, and it would be 1940 until Ireland had a navy again. And just to look at the air service then, it was called the Army Air Service originally. It wasn't renamed the Air Corps until 1924. It fares a little better in that it survives, but it survives very tenuously. There's very little use made of the air service during the Civil War, and there's very little use of made after the Civil War as well. Essentially what happened was the General Staff had very little idea about how to properly integrate the Air Service or the Air Corps into the Army itself, and there was also a huge disagreement between the General Staff and the government as to how civil aviation and military aviation should be developed. Should they be developed together, which is what the Army's position was, or should they be developed separately, which is what the government decided? And that, of course, led to underdevelopment of both sides, both military and civil aviation, until the 1940s. The Air Service also suffers, I think, from the appointment of really unsuitable personnel as commanding officers. In the 1930s, in particular in the mid-1930s, Richard Mulcahy's brother Patrick, who goes on to become a Chief of Staff and has a very illustrious career with the Defence Forces, he's appointed as GOC of the Air Service in 1936, and it's a disastrous appointment because he doesn't know anything about the air service or about flying, and he makes a number of purchases of aircraft which are wholly unsuitable for the air service's needs, such as they were, and it takes at least a decade for them to recover some of the momentum lost during the late 1930s and early 1940s when he was replaced. Now we're not long past the centenary of the end of the Civil War, and at that point the National Army strength stood at about 55,000 men or so. So there's a huge upscale from 7,000 in June 1922 to 55,000 or so by April and May 1923. By 1931, so just 8 years after the Civil War ended, the Defence Forces strength had actually dipped below 5,000 and hovered at between 5,000 and 6,000 right up until 1940. This is despite the fact that on paper it had an establishment strength of just under 15,000. Now, part of the reason for the reduction, of course, from 55,000 down is that the move to peacetime conditions meant that such a large army was completely unnecessary. It was also incredibly expensive and had cost the state a little over 17 million across 1922 and 1923. Now, that figure was ruthlessly reduced to about just under 1 million per annum for the remainder of the decade and long into the 1930s. So beginning with the reorganisation in January 1923 and a short-lived mutiny in March 1924, the National Army had made this painful transition to a formal state-controlled army with professional structures in place, and greater professionalisation then kind of followed within the constraints of falling personnel numbers and limited budgets, and in the absence of a clearly defined national defence policy, which is an issue that has dogged the Defence Forces ever since its foundation. The General Staff frequently found itself out of step with a government that was increasingly content to maintain the Defence Forces in as small a number as possible, and there was simply no appetite within Leinster House to direct funds towards the Defence Forces after the Civil War. And perhaps, I think most importantly, there was then, and continued to be for several decades, even into the current day, a firm belief that Britain could be relied upon for military assistance in the event of a threat from a belligerent power. And in July 1925, just to give you an example, the Council of Defence presented a memo to the government which outlined the urgent and absolute necessity, just to give you a quote, of providing the Council with at least the outline of a defence policy which would then allow them to dictate how the Defence Forces would evolve and train over the next decade or so. The memo warned that not only were the Defence Forces entirely dependent upon the British Army and British forces for the defence, they were incapable of providing any effective defence against a modern army, navy or air force, and that is a point that is made by the Defence Forces in every decade since that point as well, and right up to the current day with the Commission on the Defence Forces report, the exact same point is made by the Defence Forces. So the government's response, which is delivered in November 1925, was that the Defence Forces were to be, and I'm going to quote here, so organised, trained and equipped as to render capable, should the necessity arise, of full and complete coordination with the forces of the British government in the defence of the Saerstaats's territory. Now, while that's an utterly practical outlook to have at the time, given the funding that was available for the Defence Forces, it's very remarkable when you consider that it's just 3 years or 4 years removed since the end of the War of Independence. And it's also worth noting that, like I said, that very honest internal assessment by the Defence Forces that they were incapable of defending the state's territory is one, like I said, that's repeated every decade. And just to give you a sense then of the work of the Defence Forces in the decade between the end of the Civil War and 1932, when Fianna Fáil came to power This is a list of all the bodies that were established by the Defence Forces to study the problem, if I can put it that way, of how to professionalise and to modernise the Defence Forces. So collectively it entails about 6 to 7 years of intense study and producing detailed reports that were by and large ignored or shelved. And this is perhaps the most important, the most impressive, and probably the most underappreciated period in Defence Forces history. The General Staff was absolutely brimming with ideas on how to evolve and develop the Defence Forces. And of course, one important development from this particular time and from the Temporary Plans Division, which works from 1928 to 9, is the establishment of the Military College at the Curragh, which has been a cornerstone of military education ever since. But the proposals that emanated from the Army Organisation Board and from the Temporary Plans Division anticipated a larger army and far greater levels of investment than actually materialised, and apathy really then soon sets in from the late 1920s onwards. Legislation governing the Defence Forces also limited the terms of office for its 3 senior officers, so the Chief of Staff, the Adjutant General and the Quartermaster General, to just 3 years. Yet between 1922 and 1932, only Pater McMahon served as Chief of Staff for the full 3 years. His predecessor, Sean McMahon, was forced out of office in March 1924, and neither Dan Hogan, Sean McGowan or Joseph Sweeney complete a full term during the 1920s. And I think that's a strikingly high rate of turnover for young men who had come to prominence during the War of Independence and were ideologically committed to the idea of evolving and building an Irish state. And I think that it speaks to the level of disillusionment that they probably had once they realised how little support they were going to get from the Irish government. And that government's willingness, I think, to allow the Defence Forces to shrink to its barest possible minimum after the Civil War. And that's an attitude that's underpinned not just by economic limitations, but also by a deep distrust of the Defence Forces and a dismissal of its potential role and importance to the new state. This is another British Pathé. Again, you can find this on YouTube. It's a British Pathé newsreel of the annual manoeuvres undertaken in 1933. So the 1930s, it's a period of stasis for the Defence Forces. There's some stability because General Michael Brennan is appointed as Chief of Staff in 1931. He stays in place for 10 years, so we get a level of stability with him. His appointment is renewed every 3 years. And if you look at this newsreel, and I do think you could go, like I said, look at it on YouTube, it gives the impression of a very well-drilled, well-organised, well-funded force, because you see armoured cars, you see anti-aircraft guns, you see the Air Corps as well in operation. But really, nothing, as I've said before, nothing could have been further from the truth. Investment in military equipment and material at this point remained at negligible levels. Personnel numbers, like I said, were below 5,000 in 1931, hovered around that number for the rest of the decade. And in 1935, Frank Aiken, who had become Minister for Defence at this stage, informed the Dáil that Ireland was spending less on defence and military equipment than any other European nation, with the possible exceptions of Albania and Bulgaria. So it's within the context of that level of underinvestment, and with Europe inching closer towards war, that the Defence Forces is forced to turn its focus to, again, an external threat. Now, I don't want to go into the emergency in too much detail here. It's fairly well known. It's a well-known period of our history, but just to highlight these key points, and it's worth pausing, I think, at this stage to note that at the start of the Second World War, the Defence Forces is called upon for the second time in its history and the second time in less than 2 decades to defend the state from a potentially existential threat, and it rises to the challenge. So within 2 years, the number of men in uniform goes from 7,000 to just over 40,000, well-trained, well-drilled, just having completed the Blackwater manoeuvres, which is the largest ever exercise by the Defence Forces in its history. And under Dan McKenna's eye and under Dan McKenna's guidance, had become a force that was at least capable of offering some defence of the state's territory should it be necessary. But what I would rather focus on, just in terms of the emergency, is the 18th military mission and the extent to which Ireland actually cooperated with the Allies during the war, and specifically with Britain through the 18th military mission, which was a body set up to coordinate that cooperation between the Irish Defence Forces and the British forces. Now, it's fairly well known, I think, at this point, that Ireland's neutrality was very heavily inclined towards the Allies, so I don't need to go over too much here. We shared military intelligence with them, including our success in decrypting German ciphers. We shared meteorological data with them, which have most famously when reports from Blacksod Lighthouse enabled the changing of the date of the D-Day landings. And this here as well, this is the signs which were dotted around the coast, 83 signs in total. The coordinates of those were given to the British and to the American airmen, but not to the Germans. So that's all fairly well known. But the levels of cooperation, they go much deeper still, I think. And even though diplomatic tensions with Britain are at a high point for 1940 right through to the end of 1941, and there is a very much a real danger of a British invasion of Ireland. The surrender of France in June 1940, accelerated contacts between the Irish General and British General Staffs. And in June 1940, then you have the 18th Military Mission established to provide that conduit between them. And the ensuing contacts, I think, contributed to a significant easing of that tension between the British and between the Irish. So instead of the possibility of there being a British invasion of Ireland, you have cooperation to the point that facilitates British preparations to come into Ireland with its forces to resist any German invasion of the state. So the kind of cooperation that was happening was the British would send highly detailed questionnaires to the Defence Forces looking for huge amounts of information on just about every single detail about Irish defence planning and operational matters. So we would have shared information on our communication networks in Dublin, evacuation plans to move people out of the city, also ideal landing points around the country, and also the infrastructure that we planned to destroy in the event of an invasion by Germany. All that information was shared with the British so that they could make plans to come around and if they came over the border to move to use the appropriate routes. Now some of the levels of our engagement with these questionnaires varied sometimes. When they asked us exactly how many troops we had in arms and the exact dispositions, we didn't tell them that particular level of information, but normally we shared most of the stuff that we had and most of the details that we had. And of course information flowed in the other direction as well. So the British, from as early as July 1940, the British sent all of their training instructions to us that they were also issuing to their troops that were based in Northern Ireland. And they prepared special intelligence reports for us, which are distributed to General Staff. And then from November 1941, they simply forwarded on all of the British War Office's briefings to the Irish General Staff. And these were summarised by G2 branch, which was our intelligence, and then distributed around the commands. And after America enters the war, diplomatic tensions drop and the level of cooperation gets even higher. So for example, the British were permitted to establish coal and fuel dumps in Ireland. So by October 1942, there's more than 200,000 gallons of petrol stored at Carton House to facilitate the British if they came into Ireland to assist us at any stage. And of course, I think maybe the most important logistical assistance provided to the British was the establishment of the Donegal air corridor and the facilitation of British and American troop movements through Shannon and through Foynes Airport in Limerick, which was technically a breach of the rules of neutrality. So that restriction is increasingly flouted from 1942 onwards. So 18th Military Mission, it's effectively dismantled by the end of 1943 when US and British troops have left Northern Ireland and relocated to England in advance of the D-Day invasions. But that level of cooperation, like I said, it continues right through to the end of the war. And the reason I bring it up is that the role of Ireland's Foreign Service or its diplomats has been very, very heavily highlighted in terms of managing Ireland's fraught relations with Britain and with America throughout the war. But I think that 18th Military Mission and the deft management by the Defence Forces General Staff of its relationship with its British counterparts deserves far greater recognition for enabling us to cooperate much more readily with Britain and to reduce those diplomatic tensions down from where they were at their very height when Churchill took over in mid-1940. So just to move on then from the emergency to bring us into the 1950s, despite the drafting of a very comprehensive set of planning documents by the Defence Forces in late 1944, it's called the Memorandum on the Defence Forces, and they're discussed at length with the Taoiseach, Eamon de Valera, and he gives a commitment that there will never be a return to the doldrum of the 1930s for the Defence Forces, but within a decade, by the mid-1950s, they're once more at a very, very low ebb, the Defence Forces. And one of the future Chiefs of Staff, Jerry McMahon, enrolled in the cadet school in 1953, and he later recalled of the Defence Forces that he joined and when he was commissioned as withering on the vine. Those are his words, that the Defence Force at the time was withering on the vine, but that changed shortly after Ireland's admission to the United Nations in 1955. And in June 1958, the Irish government received a request from the UN Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, for 5 officers of either major or captain rank to join the UN Observer Group in Lebanon, or UNIGIL. Now, Irish deployment with UNIGIL in 1958 eventually rises to 50 officers who serve for between 3 and 6 months in Lebanon. And just here on the slide, you have 4 of those officers. There's Captain, from left to right, Captain Patrick Keogh, Captain James Liddy, Commandant Patrick Hogan, and Captain Thomas Furlong. And they're at Geneva Airport here on their way to Beirut at the end of August 1958. Now, the Defence Forces participation in UNIGIL marks not just its entry into international peacekeeping, but the beginning of that unbroken period of service with UN-mandated missions that has lasted ever since, so for more than 6 decades. And in practical terms, it really enhances the state's reputation at the UN, and it also provides a really valuable opportunity for the Defence Forces to adjust to the command and control structures of UN missions, which maintained a very different, or an operational independence from its constituent military forces. And public reaction to the Defence Forces involvement in UNIGIL is very, very positive, and most notably in the recruitment campaign of late 1958, which sees the Defence Forces strength raised just above 9,000 for the first time since the end of the 1940s. Now, these officers that went to Lebanon in 1958 were handpicked by the General Staff, and their performance there bolsters the reputation of the Defence Forces among its international peers. And that burgeoning reputation, in addition to Ireland's lack of a colonial history on the African continent, marked the Defence Forces as a really ideal candidate to participate in a UN-mandated mission in Congo with ONUC in July 1960. So just to give a quick background, internal strife and interference from Belgian gendarmerie had brought the newly independent nation of Congo to the brink of disintegration. And when its government sought assistance from the UN, Hammarskjöld once more requested Irish participation, but this time in the form of a battalion with light arms and supporting services. The 32nd Infantry Battalion is activated on the 2nd of July 1960 with a strength of 685 all ranks, and is deployed to Congo at the end of the month. Now, Major General Sean McEoin, who was appointed as Chief of Staff in January 1960, he later recalled that the speed with which the Defence Forces were required to deploy after that initial request was made caught them a little bit off guard, but the opportunity to revitalise the Defence Forces after almost a decade of withering on the vine was one that couldn't be turned down. So the troops that went across to Congo had less than 4 weeks of training and were drawn from all across the commands and all from different units. Volunteers, obviously, but all, so they had very, very little time to gel together or to train together. So when the UN requested a 2nd battalion the next month, there was very little hesitation by the government. I think that the General Staff might have had a pause at this point, but again, acquiesced, and their reservations, I think, were very well founded given the relative unpreparedness of the troops and the unsuitability of their equipment. So by September 1960, there are just under 1,400 Irish troops in Congo, which is a staggering 17% of the entire Irish Defence Forces in Congo at that time. And all the troops deployed to Congo over the next 4 years entered a very volatile situation, often very dangerous, especially in the first 18 months, up to mid-1960, well, up to the end of 1961. Acclimatization was, difficult because of a new continent. It was new conditions. There was hostility from a lot of the local tribes that they encountered, cultural differences, and they had a real inability to communicate. The first 2 battalions that went over had nobody who could speak Lugala or any of the languages that they needed to speak in Congo. And for the first time then since the Civil War, Irish troops found themselves in combat operations. And of the 26 Irish soldiers who died in Congo, 16 were killed in action. And I think it's probably worth saying that however urgent the need to revitalise the Defence Forces was, Those casualties really highlighted the grave risks that were taken by both the government and by the general staff in deploying soldiers untrained in the kind of warfare or the kind of combat operations that they would meet, and initially largely equipped with obsolete weaponry and lacking armoured transport. And that photograph there on the left is taken from 1962. It's not until the start of 1961 that armoured cars are deployed with the Irish troops to go to Congo, largely in response to what happened, the ambush at Niemba. So this is actually, 1963 is 38th Infantry Battalion. So they have modern Belgian FAL rifles, and they've got it supported by I think it's a Ford Mark VI armoured car. It was actually built in Carlow modified in Carlow during the emergency. Irish deployment with ONUC, it ends in, I think, summer 1964. Of course, it's immediately followed by deployment to Cyprus with UNFICYP. And all told, I think over the last 65 years or so, Defence Forces personnel have completed just over 74,000 tours of overseas duty. And when I last counted, it changed all the time, that was spread out across 80 separate missions, both former and currently ongoing. And just to shift gears just a little bit, in the book and when I was doing the research, what really struck me, I'm very often critical of the constraints that are placed on the Defence Forces by external factors. So the Department of Finance, for example, is a very frequent stumbling block on the Defence Forces plans because they just say no to requests for funding. The military and civil branches of the Department of Defence, they're as frequently at odds with each other as they are in unison. And successive governments have given really short shrift to defence as a ministerial portfolio. And I think that the current situation is a good example. The defence is lumped in with foreign affairs, which is a much more senior brief. And for 77 years, from the end of the Civil War up to the year 2000, no government took the trouble to define an actual defence policy, beyond sketching out the obvious requirement to protect the state's integrity, territorial integrity. So the first white paper on defence isn't published until the year 2000. And when it is published, it's published initially, its initial publication took very little heed of the Defence Forces submission on defence policy, which leads to its own problems, but I can talk about that afterwards. But I think it's also worth recalling that the Defence Forces have made plenty of missteps themselves and missed multiple opportunities to improve its own internal systems and structures. And the reason I bring this up now, just while we're talking about overseas deployment, is that the Defence Forces, they were very, very slow to learn the lessons from these initial early missions to Congo, to Cyprus, especially Congo, where there was such a kinetic situation, would be the term they would use now. But even also UNIGIL as well, to draw upon the well of information and knowledge that those officers would have brought back with them, even with just 6 months of operating with UNIGIL. After those 50 officers came home, most of them spent a night in St. Bricken's military hospital for medical processing before being allowed back to their families. They were never debriefed. There was no formal attempt by GHQ to gather information or intelligence on how ONUC, or sorry, not ONUC, but UNIGIL or the UN was structuring its operations. And it was, in fact, in 1976, the Director of Intelligence then wrote to the men and asked them for their thoughts on their service 18 years previously. So, no, that gives you a sense of, I suppose, the lack or the missed opportunities that were there. And there's also a clip, again, the Wi-Fi is not working, but this man named Michael Walsh was in the Curragh in the mid-1970s, trained by two men who he later found out had been at Jadotville, but they never told him about their experiences at Jadotville and never gave them the benefit of their knowledge. And he said, it's been rectified since, but those experiences are now much more drawn upon. Just then, if overseas deployment really was the turning point for the Defence Force, and I think gave it a purpose and a focus that it hadn't had for the first 30 or so years or 40 years of its existence, the outbreak of the Troubles, I think, in 1969 really redefines the duties and the priorities of the Defence Forces as well. In fact, the demands of internal security they very nearly spelled the end of overseas deployment due to low personnel numbers. And following the loyalist paramilitary bombings of Dublin and Monaghan in 1974, virtually every single Irish soldier then overseas was withdrawn home. A handful were left in with the United Nations Emergency Force in the Sinai. But of course, just 4 years later, Irish troops returned to Lebanon with UNIFIL, which has been the mainstay of overseas deployment ever since. But apart from then the almost ending of overseas deployment, what were the practical? I want to look at the practical impacts of the Troubles on the Defence Forces. And I'll put this map up here. It was prepared in early 1986 when it became apparent that the Anglo-Irish Agreement of November 1985 wasn't working, and it was included in a memorandum that considered the possibility of a unilateral British withdrawal from Northern Ireland, and it highlighted the areas in green where the Defence Forces might be deployed to protect nationalist or Catholic communities. And I put it up here because it has very strong echoes of a very, very similar conversation that was had in early 1970 when the Defence Forces were asked to prepare plans for hypothetical incursions into Northern Ireland to protect, again, nationalist or Catholic communities. And the Defence Forces' assessment of its own capabilities was very, very blunt. Due to inadequate training, deficiencies in personnel and equipment, they were incapable of mounting an effective cross-border military operation that would bring them into conflict with British security forces. So in practical terms then, the Troubles really exposes some serious problems within the Defence Forces. Personnel numbers were increased in response both to the Troubles and to the elevated levels of subversive and terrorist activity within the Irish state itself. Sustained recruiting campaigns brought personnel numbers up from just over 8,000 in 1969 to 13,500 a decade later, and that reaches a high of 14,771 in 1977. That remains the highest number the Defence Force have had in uniform since the end of the emergency, and since indeed. And if I take 1975 just as an example, it gives you a sense, I suppose, of the scale of the commitment that the Defence Forces had to internal security in response to the Troubles. There were 5,500 military parties prepared for checkpoint duties, so they manned and set up about 10,000 checkpoints jointly with the Gardaí. They conducted about 5,400 joint patrols along the border. This is from 1985. Escort duties increased massively, so typically for transportation of explosives, there was more than 1,000 of those in 1975, and there were 300 requests for the bomb disposal unit as well. They escorted cash movements, they provided military guards for transportation and storage of industrial explosives, and of course guarding politically subversive or terrorist prisoners at Portlaoise and elsewhere. This is from the early 90s. This is on the Louth-Armagh border. I think it's 29th Battalion. Could be wrong on that. But before 1970, again, another practical impact. Before 1970, the Defence Forces maintained no permanent military post above sort of an imaginary line stretching from Gormanston across to Galway, with the exception of Finnercamp. But by the end of the 1970s, that number had risen to 11. So you had new barracks constructed and outposts constructed, including Monaghan and various other places as well. And in terms of personnel, it's worth pointing out that very similar to overseas deployment, the units that were initially deployed along the border were ad hoc, drawn from all across the Defence Forces. So again, very little cohesion, given very little time to train as units. And in response to that, there was a review of border operations in 1971, and that highlighted real serious problems with these kind of ad hoc arrangements. So the response was to raise 27th and 28th Infantry Battalions in September 1973, and that was added to 3 years later when the 29th Battalion was raised as well. This is 27th Infantry Battalion, from 1990s. And two other quick points I think to make about the early years of the Troubles, or maybe all of the years of the Troubles. The FCA proved crucial to when the resources of the Defence Forces, their permanent Defence Forces, were stretched to their limits. The FCA fulfilled static duties across a lot of the barracks and other posts and allowed the permanent Defence Forces to actually go out on patrol. And I think the Army Ranger Wing also has its roots in 1969. I'm not sure if it's a direct relationship or if there's a direct correlation, but they certainly, the first officers went across to Fort Benning to train with the Army Rangers at that point. And by the middle of the 1970s then, there were, I think, more than 300 fully trained Rangers and special assault groups integrated to most of the commands. They were then, of course, reconfigured into the Army Ranger Wing in March 1980. Now, I'm just going to finish up relatively quickly. I know want to get out before 8:30. Just to look at the admission of women to the Defence Forces, just as kind of one of the last things to look at and talk about. The recent findings of the Independent Review Group in its investigation into dignity and equality issues in the Defence Forces, they kind of offer a very sobering insight into the failures of both the Defence Forces and the Department of Defence to adequately protect the women who have served with the nation's military. And these failures came despite the emergence of similar issues in the late 90s, early 2000s, and the implementation of really major reforms of military structures in response to those findings. Between 2004 and 2014, the Independent Monitoring Group was set up and put in place really impressive structures, which clearly solved a lot of issues, but left others unsolved. But the main point to make is to look at when women first joined the Defence Forces. And the slightly misleading answer is 1922, when Michael Collins gave Bridget Lyons Thornton a commission as an officer. She was a doctor. She served with the National Army for 2 years, or the Defence Forces for 2 years, and then ended it because of a bout of tuberculosis. But she remained the only woman to serve with the Defence Forces until 1980. And by the 1970s, then Ireland was seriously out of step with its international counterparts when it came to the recruitment for women. So proposals to allow women to join the Defence Forces were first aired in the mid-1970s and included in the programme for government offered by Fianna Fáil in 1978. And it convened then a working body to examine the issue and to put forward proposals for admitting women. And its first report included the very underwhelming conclusion that women's service corps or women could have a useful role as part of the Defence Forces. And I think then that report kind of sets the tone, and there's an inequality and a kind of enduring casual dismissal of the value women might add to the Defence Forces baked into the system from the very, very beginning. And that's clear not just from that report, but also the Minister for Defence, Robert Malloy, who was a very good Minister for Defence for the Defence Forces in general. He recommended that the Women's Service Corps should be allowed because it could participate in a worthwhile and conspicuous manner in ceremonial occasions. Female personnel would also be non-combatant and ineligible for duties of a security or operational nature under arms. And government approval then was granted in June 1979. And there was 4 cadetships offered to train in the initial intake of women officers in December 1979. They had to have a university degree, even though male recruits or male cadets only had to have a leaving cert. But even with that stipulation in place, there was more than 1,000 applications received for those 4 places. And those 4 women then arrived in the Curragh to begin training on the 10th of March 1980. And they were Marie O'Donoghue, Colette Harrison, Maureen McHenry, and Marie Flynn. The 4 of them are in this photograph. And on the 27th of April 1981, which is when this photograph was taken, the first 8 female cadets received their commissions. And 6 months later then, the first cohort of female recruits, which is 38 in total, passed out as members of the 4th Platoon at the Curragh under the command of Lieutenant Marie O'Donoghue. But the Women's Service Corps, which was initially set up to take in these female recruits, was disbanded in October 1980, which is a reflection of the fact that this was a very, very poorly thought out exercise. They were just supposed to be dumped into, there was no place for them within the establishment or within the structures of the Defence Forces. So they disbanded and they dispersed around the troops or around the army. And recruitment of women, there was an intent that there would be 7, 8, 9, 10% of the Defence Forces would be female within 10 years. But by 1991, there were only 89 women in the Defence Forces, which is less than 1% of the total strength. And a decade after their admission, they were still prevented from fulfilling duties of an operational or security nature under arms. With just a few exceptions, they weren't permitted to serve as officers in the infantry, artillery, or cavalry, and were restricted to serving at force headquarters while serving on UN peacekeeping missions. And these are the first 3 women to serve overseas. This is them pictured on their arrival back in Dublin Airport. Now, when the General Staff reviewed the situation in 1990-1991, they decided that they were happy with how things were set up, but they got such a backlash from the women who were then serving with the Defence Forces, and also from the Judge Advocate General's office, which raised serious issues in terms of equality legislation and the fact that the legislation required the Defence Forces to be more open to women serving in the same capacity as their male counterparts. That led to a rethink, and the Chief of Staff at the time in 1991, Lieutenant General James Parker, he convened another board in October 1991, and they belatedly recognised that international norms were increasingly tending towards full integration of women soldiers, and it recommended that women be allowed to fully participate in all aspects of the Defence Forces from that point onwards. So restrictions on deployment of women were removed in 1993, and the full integration of women was achieved over the remainder of the decade. And I'll just finish up by just talking very, very quickly about the Commission on the Defence. There's a huge amount of topics that I could get into, and I do go into them in the book in quite a lot of detail, but just to look up to finish with the Commission on the Defence Forces. They were late submitting their report, if you remember. It came in about February 2022, and I was praying that they wouldn't actually submit it when I was finishing the book, because then I'd have to include it in the book, but I did unfortunately have to give some thoughts on it in the book itself. And what they do, I think, what they did is that, well, what I would say, just maybe to preface this a little bit, I think that the Defence Forces have remained and still remain something of an enigma to the general Irish public. They're one of the most frequently discussed, yes, least understood elements of the public sector. Unlike foreign policy, with which the Defence Forces have been intimately entwined for the last 6 decades, there's never really been a concerted effort to outline the Defence Forces mission to the general public. Overseas activities really ensure a very high profile, but I think that there remains a broader confusion about the role and the purpose of the Defence Forces to the general layman. And as I said, as I was finishing the book, the Commission on the Defence Forces delivered its report, and in which it highlighted a number of organisational challenges, funding issues, and that required attention both from within and without the Defence Forces. And the government's response was to accept the second level of recommendations. And if those recommendations are adopted and followed through, I think that this marks an inflection point for the Defence Forces, one which suggests to me an evolutionary moment which is of a similar nature to that between 1922 and 1924, when the IRA was transformed into the National Army and then into the Defence Forces. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much for